Imagine a car that runs on 94% pure, fresh air. Imagine too that it's made of natural materials, like wood, fine Connolly leather, and pure new wool that's locally sourced. And what if it were made from a particular grade of British steel that combines with the moisture in the air to recycle itself over time into nothing at all? Now that we've established its environmental credentials, let's fire up the V12. This is, of course, a Jaguar XJ-S. Launched in 1975, this one is actually a 1982 car, which means it's an HE, HE for high efficiency. And even though it's badged high efficiency, of course, let's be honest, this car doesn't really have any environmental credentials. It's a 5.3 litre V12 and it does something in the teens miles to the gallon. So even though it runs on 94% pure air, every schoolboy will tell you that that's only because that's the efficient point for maximum combustion of a petrol-air mixture. So there's nothing unique to this car in that. It's very low. It's not very practical. The cabin here is quite small. It's got loads of legroom in the front. You sit very low on the floor, which is actually very comfortable even on long journeys and has quite a special feeling to it. But you're fairly cosy with your front seat passenger here. Nothing wrong with that. And anybody who cadges a lift off you and wants to sit in the back, well, frankly, that's its own punishment. And we're already going too fast. I'm not terribly well acquainted with the red line, if I'm honest, because by the time you hit the red line, you're already well on your way towards the horizon. The steering is relatively light. This steering wheel is frankly enormous by modern standards and relatively thin rimmed. Nice to hold though, nice soft leather, the stitching's nicely done, it's not full of knots and general bits of catgut and all the sort of things you sometimes get on stitched steering wheels. But yeah, the steering's very light, but actually now that I've had some work done on it to sort it out, this one is reasonably precise. It's very easy to place. This sort of road, this is a well, it's fairly small as an A road goes, but it's mostly sweeping bends, and it's a very nice car to pilot along this sort of road. Twisty, narrow tracks and things are not its natural habitat. And frankly, by the time your eye line, which is somewhere in the back half of the car as you drive along, or around the midpoint, by the time your eye line arrives around a narrow bend, the front of the car has already met anything that might be coming towards you. So you're slightly reliant on the goodwill and good driving of your fellow road users. The XJS was launched onto the world in 1975, but design work had started a lot earlier, in the late 60s, under Malcolm Sayer, who was a very talented mathematician and aerodynamicist. Came from the Bristol Aircraft Company, was where he learned his trade and started his career. He had a hand in the streamlining of Jaguar's successful racing C-types, D-types and the road-going E-type. And he worked with Sir William Lyons, the founder of Jaguar, on the early styling of the XJS. And these flying buttresses at the rear were always part of that design, and are an aerodynamic design, with this twist being designed to shape the airflow across the rear and balance out the areas of high and low pressure to reduce drag and aid fuel efficiency and top speed. The E-Type had got a bit Vegas Elvis by this time, and it had a longer wheelbase and flared wheel arches and lost some of the purity of the earlier styling. And by the time its production finished in 1974, it was getting quite difficult to give away for Jaguar. The styling was horribly dated by then. This was a departure. It was more modern. It was more efficient. It met newer safety regulations as well. Things like the big federalized rubber bumpers, the cancellation of a planned fully open convertible version. Were all driven by expected, and in some cases real, mainly North American safety legislation. Some argue that the styling is unsuccessful. I disagree. I find it very pleasing. There are many echoes in the proportions of the E-Type if you look closely. If you think of an E-Type with the lines straightened out, then things like this indentation of the door, the angle of the windscreen, the very short wheelbase, this long bonnet, this long low bonnet. Headlamps are proud. The original styling designs were for a sloping nose with pop-up lights, but that was something that was expected to be outlawed by future legislation, as indeed it has been now. The styling, though, is greatly aided, I think, by the facelift that came in 1981 with the high efficiency version of this engine. Things like these chromed fillets on the bumpers rather than the very austere plain fat black bumpers of the original versions. In the interior, the early ones were all black plastic. It was very modernist, very minimal, very much the a futuristic design. With the HE version came first initially some thin slivers of walnut. Later, in the later 80s, that got added to, and more was added. And things like lattice wheels came in then. I rather like these starfish versions, as they tend to get called. They have a kind of purity and simplicity to them, rather than the sort of slightly knowing retro look of the latticed alloys that came later. I bought this car in 2015 for £2,000 with 70-something thousand miles on the clock, an MOT and a fairly thick file of history. It's not immaculate. There's some rust on the bumpers and some micro blistering of the paint on the boot lid, but it's solid in the places that XJS's usually aren't, like the sills, the window surrounds and underneath. It had been little used for a long time, and it needed work to bring up the brakes and steering and gearbox up to scratch. It needed a new headlining that I fitted myself with some swearing and a thorough service, but in all I've probably spent another £2,000 to £3,000 on it. If you shop around today, you can find one in similar good usable condition to this one, not perfect but solid and sound, for around £4,000 give or take. Parts and support are still generally plentiful. Fuel economy is pretty grim, but depreciation is about nil. Tax is £265 a year, and classic car insurance is probably about half that. In return, you get a superbly smooth and comfortable cruiser with a serene ride quality that's a world apart from any modern car. It's long and low and sleek and no less eye-catching after 40 years. It looks like nothing else, with a charm that means its opulence isn't loaded with arrogance. It speaks of power without aggression, style without shouting, performance without discernible effort. If, like me, you've always admired the XJ-S, now is probably the moment to indulge yourself. They're about 1/5 the price of a wreck of an E-Type. and about a third of the price of a Porsche 928 or Mercedes SL, or even an SLC or SEC, and none of those has a V12. In HE form, it was regarded when new as simply one of the finest cars in the world. I think it still is.